plus forte que la France, mais comment vous dire, les Français ont parfaitement respecté le confinement la première fois et la deuxième fois. Ils ont été solidaires, ils ont compris quand il fallait porter un masque à l'intérieur, puis à l'extérieur de chez eux. Évidemment que c'est difficile pour les acteurs économiques de voir des commerces fermés, de voir l'obligation de faire du télétravail, d'avoir moins de transports en commun. Mais d'une part, ils en ont compris le sens, c'est-à-dire sauver des vies. Le président de la République français avait dit « quoi qu'il en coûte ». Et d'autre part, tous ces acteurs économiques ont été accompagnés, et ils le sont toujours, par l'État du début à la fin. Un commerçant qui doit fermer sa boutique, par exemple, peut recevoir jusqu'à 10 000 € par mois d'aide financière. Ses loyers peuvent être payés. Il peut avoir des prêts garantis par l'État. Nous faisons en sorte de ne laisser mourir aucun commerce et de limiter le plus possible l'impact économique. Mais cet impact, évidemment, il est sévère en France comme dans le reste de l'Europe, avec une récession qui a suivi la première vague de confinement.
Mais, monsieur le ministre, il y a beaucoup de Français qui sont quand même sceptiques d'un vaccin, et dans ce vaccin qu'on donnera très bientôt. Qu'est-ce que vous dites à ces gens? Comment persuader les Français qui sont sceptiques, qui sont contre se vacciner? Comment les persuader?
C'est un comble dans le pays de Pasteur qu'il y ait autant de personnes qui ne croient pas au vaccin. D'abord, nous devons faire acte de pédagogie, d'explication. Moi, je signerai un arrêté comme ministre qui permet aux gens d'être vaccinés quand nous aurons un vaccin qui sera à la fois sûr et efficace. Je crois à la transparence, je crois à la communication, à l'explication. Les Français, ils sont un peu comme saint Thomas. C'est-à-dire, ils croient une fois qu'ils ont vu. Donc moi, je suis persuadé que quand ils verront que le vaccin est efficace et qu'il peut sauver des vies, ils seront nombreux à vouloir se faire vacciner.
Ok. Et comment éviter une troisième vague d'infection autour de Noël? Doit-on maintenir un certain niveau de confinement pendant ces vacances?
Oui, nous avons fait le choix d'adapter le confinement sans lever totalement le confinement. D'abord, le confinement a été encore une fois très efficace en France, puisque nous perdons environ un tiers de nouveaux cas chaque semaine, signe que cette méthode fonctionne. Mais ça ne peut pas être une méthode de gestion d'une épidémie, et nous voulons évidemment éviter une troisième vague qui imposerait un nouveau confinement. Donc nous renforçons notre système de tests en déployant massivement des tests antigéniques. Nous renforçons notre système de contact tracing en développant de nouvelles équipes et puis en impliquant davantage les citoyens. Nous allons développer également le contact tracing rétrospectif, ce qu'on appelle à la japonaise, pour aller encore plus loin dans la recherche des cas. Et puis nous renforçons encore notre capacité à accompagner les personnes lorsqu'elles sont isolées, c'est-à-dire lorsqu'elles sont positives ou cas contact. Donc nous croyons beaucoup à cela, à la pédagogie, et puis progressivement, nous allons à nouveau alléger les contraintes semaine après semaine en fonction de la situation épidémique, sans urgence, parce que nous ne voulons pas que la levée des contraintes s'accompagne d'une réascension du virus.
Au sujet de ce contact tracing, on a eu des difficultés à coordonner ça au niveau européen. L'Union européenne est critiquée par son manque de coordination pour faire face à la crise pandémique. Que devrait-elle faire maintenant?
Moi, d'abord, je célèbre l'Europe pour sa capacité à passer des commandes. La Commission européenne a passé des commandes déjà avec plusieurs laboratoires, assurant non seulement une juste répartition des vaccins au prorata des populations de chaque pays européen, mais également s'engageant pour les pays les plus pauvres qui n'auront pas forcément accès aux vaccins, et ça j'en suis très fier. Mes partenaires européens et moi, nous sommes rencontrés très nombreuses fois, nous échangeons souvent par téléphone sur les différentes méthodes, nous échangeons les données scientifiques, nous échangeons autour des stratégies. Et quand on regarde finalement, à part quelques dispositions particulières qui peuvent être prises par des pays sans être prises par les pays voisins, globalement, nous avons la même stratégie aujourd'hui et nous sommes assez alignés les uns sur les autres. Donc il y a peut-être eu un retard à l'allumage, parce que l'épidémie, elle a frappé d'abord un pays, puis 3 pays, et d'autres pays pensaient être à l'abri de tout cela. Et ensuite, nous avons réussi à nous coordonner, et nous allons renforcer encore cela.
La santé mentale est un enjeu lors du European Health Summit. Et vous avez récemment dit qu'elle s'est détériorée en France à cause de la pandémie. Que devrions-nous faire à ce sujet?
Oui, c'est vrai que la santé mentale se détériore quand vous êtes confiné, quand vous avez peur de perdre votre emploi, quand vous avez peur de tomber malade, quand vous avez contaminé un proche sans le vouloir, lorsque vous avez perdu un proche du virus, forcément se mélange la peur sanitaire et la peur économique, plus la réduction des activités, ce qui provoque des poussées d'anxiété, parfois des symptômes de dépression. Nous avons mis tout de suite en place des numéros gratuits d'appel avec des équipes de psychiatres, de psychologues, d'éducateurs qui répondent aux questions, qui peuvent orienter les gens qui le souhaitent. Ce numéro reçoit plus de 20 000 appels par jour dans notre pays. Nous avons également missionné des experts pour chercher des indicateurs précoces de détérioration de l'état de santé mentale de la population. Et nous avons, mais c'est le cas en France et c'est le cas partout en Europe, ce qu'on appelle un travail de résilience collective à faire, c'est-à-dire être capable d'accepter le fait que l'épidémie n'a pas disparu, que la période que nous avons vécue était difficile, mais d'arriver à en ressortir plus fort. Et il faut donner pour cela des perspectives.
Combien est-ce la solution en ligne, virtuelle, le projet e-health de l'Union européenne, parmi d'autres solutions numériques, comment peuvent-elles aider?
Alors, je crois énormément au numérique en santé. Vous savez, en France, nous réalisions seulement 10 000 actes de téléconsultation par semaine dans notre pays avant la pandémie. Quand la pandémie a commencé, j'ai autorisé la téléconsultation pour les médecins, les infirmiers, les kinés, par téléphone, par Skype, par WhatsApp. Nous sommes montés à 1 million de téléconsultations par semaine. C'est-à-dire on a multiplié par 100 du jour au lendemain. Aujourd'hui, le numérique, il irrigue toutes les structures de santé, que ce soit en ville ou à l'hôpital, ou pour les maisons pour personnes âgées. Nous avons maintenant investi 2,5 milliards d'euros en plus pour aider à la numérisation de toutes les structures sanitaires. Et tout ce qui va être application, le hard et le soft, sont extrêmement précieux dans la période. On le voit dans une pandémie. Et c'est un acquis de la crise que nous allons conserver pour traiter les maladies chroniques telles que les cancers.
Combien sont ces solutions au niveau national et au niveau européen? Parce que faut-il confier davantage de pouvoir à l'Union européenne dans le domaine de la santé? Parce qu'en ce moment, c'est le domaine national plutôt. Est-ce qu'il faut donner plus de pouvoir au niveau européen?
Moi, je n'ai pas peur de confier davantage de responsabilités à l'Europe en matière de santé. La protection sociale, le système de protection sociale, il doit rester national. Chacun a son histoire, même si je note qu'il y a des inégalités de santé qui peuvent être très fortes d'un pays à l'autre de l'Union européenne. Ouais. Je crois que la politique de santé publique, elle doit être davantage partagée au niveau européen. Je crois que la recherche en santé doit être aussi partagée. Il n'est pas utile que chaque pays fasse la même recherche sur des cancers pédiatriques, par exemple. Il vaut mieux mutualiser la recherche. Je crois que nous avons aussi vocation à développer des géants dans le domaine des biotechnologies ou des technologies numériques en santé, que nous devons davantage coopérer. Et puis, je crois profondément que pour être aimé par les peuples, l'Europe, elle doit parler aux gens, elle doit être en proximité, elle doit toucher les gens au cœur. Et la santé fait partie des premières priorités pour les populations européennes. Donc il ne faut pas avoir peur de cela. Moi, je suis pour davantage d'intégration européenne en matière de politique sanitaire.
OK. Et au cours de la pandémie, il y a d'autres maladies qui ont été négligées. Par exemple, le combat contre le cancer, qui est la deuxième cause de décès en Europe. Que fait le gouvernement français pour remédier cette situation?
Alors, je ne dirais pas que les maladies ont été négligées. En revanche, beaucoup de patients ont eu peur d'aller consulter un médecin pendant le confinement parce qu'ils avaient peur d'y attraper le virus. D'autres, des médecins, ont dû fermer leur cabinet parce qu'ils n'avaient pas assez d'équipements de protection. C'était pendant la première vague. Et par ailleurs, des soins de chirurgie ont dû être déprogrammés pour libérer des lits de réanimation ou transformer des blocs opératoires en salle de réanimation. Aujourd'hui, nous avons vraiment sanctuarisé la chirurgie en cancérologie. Nous appelons massivement les patients qui ont des maladies chroniques, telles que des cancers, à ne pas interrompre leurs soins. Nous sommes extrêmement vigilants sur ce point.
Oui, parce qu'il y a beaucoup de patients avec du cancer qui n'ont pas pu soit se soindre ou bien qui n'ont pas pu se tester. Donc on verra plus de morts, en fait, dans les prochains mois, non?
Je ne sais pas si nous verrons plus de morts. En tout cas, il y a eu des ruptures de prise en charge et de traitement de maladies chroniques comme les cancers. Beaucoup ont été rattrapés, beaucoup d'interventions chirurgicales qui avaient dû être suspendues à cause du confinement ont été reprises ensuite pendant l'été. Ouais. Mais nous devons être extrêmement vigilants. Mais pour d'autres maladies chroniques, pour les maladies cardio-respiratoires, pour l'obésité, pour les addictions, on sait que les suivis des maladies chroniques n'ont pas été faciles pendant la période. Donc nous suivons ça de très près avec des indicateurs qui nous montreront si oui ou non il y a une surmortalité. Et nous travaillons avec les médecins pour qu'ils nous fassent remonter les éventuels constats qu'ils ont sur le terrain.
Et dernièrement, si on voit que ces vaccins sont mis en marche. Combien êtes-vous optimiste ou pessimiste qu'on aura un été 2021 normal ou presque normal?
Je ne sais pas vous dire à cette heure-ci, puisque nous commençons juste à avoir accès aux data scientifiques concernant les vaccins.
Ouais.
Donc, je ne peux pas encore savoir précisément quel type de population sera vaccinée. Ce que je sais, c'est que nous allons faire le maximum en Europe pour vacciner nos populations, que nous disposons des vaccins en grand nombre, que nous avons diversifié le sourcing de ces vaccins auprès des différents laboratoires, et que probablement le vaccin est une des clés pour acquérir une immunité collective efficace. Pendant combien de temps ces vaccins sont-ils efficaces ? Nous verrons, mais je souhaite véritablement qu'on puisse en sortir, qu'on puisse tourner la page de cette pandémie et se projeter dans le monde d'après.
Espérons bien. Monsieur le ministre, merci beaucoup de nous avoir joints sur
Merci beaucoup pour l'invitation.
European Health Summit. Merci beaucoup.
So welcome back to the European Health Summit. We're now moving into our next session. We've talked about the vaccines. We've talked about some of the European healthcare plans going into the future as the European Union seeks to create that European Health Union. And now we're moving into sustainable healthcare and the innovation that may play in on the sector. And now we're joined by four panelists that represent a number of views here. Giulia Del Brenna, who works for DG GROW at the European Commission. She was also very much in charge of the Corona dossier when the crisis was at its peak. We're also joined by Reda Guia, who is regional president for Pfizer. He is also the international developed markets for Pfizer Rare Diseases. We're joined also by Sam Persman, who is an advisor to the Prime Minister of Belgium, Alexander De Croo, when it comes to healthcare. And we're also joined by Jean-Charles Samulien-Verbe, who is CEO at Elan, that's an insurer. And we are, first of all, just going to start with a round of questions to place us in terms of just how key innovation could be in the future of healthcare. Reda, I was wondering if you could kick off with that. You work at Pfizer. This is one of the big names when it comes to big pharma. How key is innovation when it comes to future treatments, and in your particular case, when it comes to rare diseases, where research is so key and plays such an important role?
Sure, Maria, and thank you. And this is definitely a key area to address. And we believe that innovative medicines are an enabler for EU healthcare sustainability. However, this will require, to reach this objective, it will require two things to happen. The first one is collaboration and partnerships among the many actors across the healthcare sectors. Some of them are actually present with us today, private, public actors, and we've seen how this collaboration during the coronavirus crisis has helped and accelerated the vaccines, the development of the vaccines. The second enabler is definitely to focus on what matters more for patients, and what matters for patients is the outcomes. It's the health benefits that innovations can bring. Now, what I would like to do is just, focusing on the pharma sector. and companies working in healthcare, and zooming more on Pfizer. Our purpose in Pfizer is basically working on innovation. Our purpose is to develop breakthrough innovation that will change patients' lives. And on a more personal note, if I may, I have a great passion for innovation. I've been working directly or indirectly on innovation for a number of years. And this is because I believe, like everyone else, I think today, is that patients deserve innovation. And it is our duty, our collective duty, to deliver this innovation to all patients.
Right, and Julia, I was wondering if you could pick up on that, and I know that you were very much involved in how the Commission looked at the corona crisis. I wonder how you saw innovation play into that and how you think it could play looking into the future. We know there's a risk of a third wave. We also know there's major vaccination coming through. So how do you see innovation playing into all of this?
Thank you very much, Maria. First of all, thank you for having me in this panel. I fully agree with what Reda just said, but innovation was key in dealing with the crisis, and we hopefully are getting there for vaccines. And we could do that because in Europe we have a long tradition of innovation, but also we have a long tradition of working together with other stakeholders. The crisis has shown not only that this is important, but it has to be done more. One of the reasons why we managed to globally to get to vaccines in such a record time is that stakeholders not only were strong, they had capacity to innovate, but that we could work together. From the start of the crisis, regulators sat down with companies, politicians sat down with companies and associations to get this work through. It was possible because we have wonderful technologies. It was possible because we can work even as in this conference virtually, but also it was possible because in the last 20 years we put together some regulatory centralized ways of working that allowed for that. And this is really a lesson for the future. If we want education to work, it has we have to have the good ecosystem, the good background conditions. We have to make it affordable, we have to make it accessible, and we have all to sit down and work together from the start to have the right innovation at the right time for the right people. Thank you.
Right, thank you so much. We're going to come back on that point on collaboration in a minute. But first, I want to also put a question to you, Sam. I mean, you're working very closely with the Belgian government, with the Belgian Prime Minister and the task force that has put together to deal with the corona crisis. We know there's very few, or I would say very key weeks coming up, especially because you're going to have to get this mass vaccination program going and so on. So when you look at the way that the public and the private sector are working on this, where do you see areas of collaboration between the two of them to make it more effective?
Thanks, Maria. Yes, and I'm in a privileged position. I think I was working in the field before. I was trained as a physician, so I got the experience firsthand of treating patients, and now in the position of advising the Prime Minister on topics that I used to work in. So I try to speak for a lot of colleagues and many other physicians in Belgium. The collaboration, or how would I say, like how looking for sustainability in terms of innovation, especially in Europe. I think the elephant in the room, and I think Reda can agree, is the price of the drugs. I think sustainability can only be there if it's affordable, and if you can obviously at the right price bring the drugs to the patients and innovation to the patient, right? And I believe that as speaking for a government, I think you can only spend €1 once. So it's really important to find a balance between innovation partly paid for by governments, because education, as you know, in large parts of Europe is government funded, and on the other hand, respecting the IP of pharma companies. And I think it's a delicate balance, but I think on a wider EU scale, I think it's the right level to leverage innovation and especially for rare diseases, because the market in each country is so small. But for the EU as a whole, we're talking about 20 million patients.
Right, and you bring up two key issues here, which have to do with the price point, the innovation that has got to be there, that takes a lot of investment, but also has to be affordable, and where the two may come in. But I also think that it's almost like an obvious segue into the question that I wanted to put to you, Jean-Charles, which is when you look at insurers, you sometimes do make the link between the big pharma and some of the government policies and the actual patient. You're that middle person when you take up an insurer. So as an insurer company, where do you see your role coming into sustainability and providing some of the innovation, but I guess, again, going back to that point, in a way that it's affordable but also good for a patient?
We had a very good answers from Reda and from Sam on the importance of innovation for outcomes. It's almost obvious we should focus on outcomes, the importance of costs. But I think what is really important for the system, and we see that as digital insurance companies that not only focus on insurance, but also really on navigating the system, is that it's not only outcomes that matter to patients, to people, it's the experience, the empathy in the system, that they felt understood. And for me, I think part of our job and part of our job in healthcare is, of course, you want to help people medically, but you also want to alleviate anxiety, uncertainty about the cost, about the experience, about the different steps. And I think our job when we try to connect all those stakeholders is really to be that key player that brings like that peace of mind of I'm going to get covered, I'm going to know how to navigate the system, and it's going to be explained in words that I understand, that I feel are personalized to me. And I think the really hard balance is we try to find systemic solutions to problems, but every patient, every user feels that they are very unique. And how you match that and how you use technology and innovation to match that standardization of the system with the matching. And then you need to take into account cost and outcome. And that's the tough balance about being the insurance company, which is trying to know what you reimburse, when you reimburse it, to who. And there is no magic answer and magic equation to that. But I think that technology and innovation can really help us to at least provide a universal coverage, but a very personalized experience on how to access that coverage.
Okay, and just to follow up on all of that, because I guess we can all agree that there's many stakeholders when you look at the research that goes into making a treatment, when you look at the different stages that a treatment has to go through before it gets the approval, and then it gets to the policymaker. And I'm happy that we're all represented here, because to some extent you do represent every stage and on that chain. And Red, I want to go back to you on the point that you made, stressing many times, you said in your previous intervention, the idea of collaboration. We also talked about things like making it more affordable. Are there ways in which that innovation, that collaboration could actually make a product that's effective, that gets to a patient in a way that it works? But what areas specifically would you say we could leverage to provide that quicker, efficiently, but also affordably?
Sure, Maria. And you're touching there on a very important point when you speak about collaboration. If I focus on pan-European collaboration, just on Europe, collaboration on clinical trials is extremely important. I think that in Europe, even though the number of trials has increased, the number of patients that have been included in clinical trials have increased in the past 10 years, we are still behind the US. We are still behind Asia. And you see, clinical trials are very important when it comes to innovation, because it allows patients, especially early stages of the clinical development, to have hope, to have access, to a clinical trial that provides hope, or also that gives them perspective. It also allows our institutions, our academic institutions, to develop experience about the disease and about these products. So, answering your question, what would be important is how to streamline the current regulations when it comes to clinical trial. Another one is real-world experience. So what happens today is once a product makes it to the patient's hands, we need to follow the patients, and you need databases, you need registries to follow the patients for scientific reasons. There's a scientific need to understand more the product long term. It's also for regulatory needs. It's, I would say, also for payers' needs to understand the efficacy of this product going forward. And instead of having, all these databases country per country across the EU members, if we can all consolidate it into one European database, it's much better for patient outcomes. And to Jean-Charles, what Jean-Charles has mentioned, which is the experience of patients. We have the experience not just of one patient, but of many segments of patients across all ages. Collaborating across regulatory processes, for example. Today we have regulation that would allow Europe, to accelerate the regulatory process. I think there is room for improvement there, definitely room for improvement there when it comes to this one. When you look at products, you always get an approval first in the US, and then months, or even in some cases years later, it's in. So, there are many areas where we can collaborate together.
Exactly. And look, you make a very good point there, because it is true that the FDA, the U.S. agency, does tend to act quicker on that front, and that medicines do tend to get approved there, and to some extent quicker than they would in Europe. So, Julia, I want to put that question to you. Is it because Europe perhaps needs to streamline? Is this just because we still don't have that fully standardized health policy? How can you, to some extent, become more efficient and still produce a good product and a good treatment?
Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Reda. Yes, this does happen. And in the adopted last week pharma strategy, there are a number of avenues where regulatory cooperation and rules can be improved, including for clinical trials, that Reda very rightly mentioned. But still, we have to maintain our standards of efficacy and safety. It's very important that the system is trusted. And Jean-Charles mentioned that healthcare must be an experience. And trust is key. So the pharma strategy has shown some avenues, and we hope stakeholders will react to this on how to make the regulatory process more efficient, but without compromising ever on safety and efficacy. Because it's all very well to have something coming very fast to the market, but if the product is not taken up, and we have, I imagine you have talked and you will talk still today about vaccine hesitancy, if the product is not taken up, if the second dose is not done for the vaccine, for a vaccine that needs 2 doses, because the patient experience is not ideal, because I've read on the press some articles that worried me about safety and efficacy, then it's all for nothing. It's an incredible waste of money, and apart from that, the innovation is all for money. So I really would concur with Jean-Charles that we need a patient experience, and we also need a company experience. And what happened now in the COVID crisis was very important for a number of reasons, obviously of public health, but also because it showed very clearly to all of us collectively what we do well and what we can improve, and what should perhaps be more centralized, and what is more of the competence of the member states. So we have collectively to learn lessons from that, also in communication, but without ever compromising on safety and efficacy. And this time, hopefully, the approval of the EMA on vaccines won't be years after the FDA. Perhaps there will be some lag, but that hopefully we will be able to catch up with more efficiency in logistics and vaccination campaigns. Thank you.
Right, and also as a reminder on that point, when we heard from the head of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, this morning, again, repeating this idea that she does believe there is potential that the first Europeans could get vaccinated before the end of the year. So that's the end of this month, just a few weeks' time. But, you know, Sam, I wonder, going back to what we talked about, perhaps more on the trial stages, the policy making, but you to some extent have had a very direct impression and also a very direct almost implication working for the Belgian government during a pandemic in terms of how putting something from theory to practice can be difficult. You can see bottlenecks. There's areas where perhaps things could still be improved. So I wonder if, given your experience, everything that you've seen over the past few months, where are the areas where for you clearly there is still room for improvement?
Very good point, and I think it touches a bit on what Reda raised as well. It's the real-world evidence. I think in times of crisis and in times of a pandemic, we have to be a bit more pragmatic in the way that we obviously randomized controlled trials are the gold standard of scientific research, and we have to get as much as evidence from those trials. But again, in times of crisis, things have to go fast. And in other disease areas, and Reda can confirm in the rare disease space, for example, you just don't have the patients. So I think, and I know the European Commission and European Union bodies are putting a greater emphasis on these on this real world evidence. And I think as a government, this type of evidence will become increasingly important over the coming years for drug approval, but also to run trials and in a certain extent, the greater emphasis on real world evidence takes away the critique that in a randomized controlled trial only and largely men from age 18 to 65 are selected without any comorbidities, etc. So actually, to some extent, the real-world data, they reflect just real life much better. And maybe the evidence we get from them is not as bad as we think it is. Because now we always say, like, real RCTs, the randomized controlled trials, are the very best and the golden standard, which is the case. But to me, it's very, I'm very glad to see the increasing importance, and especially in the past few months, of the real-world evidence piece.
Right, and you know, I wanted to do a follow-up with you on this, Sam, because another thing that we've seen play out during the corona crisis is that you've had big pharma come into play, but also some of the smaller names. And I'm thinking, you know, the Pfizer-BioNTech, just because it's been one of the catchy ones that have been very successful, but also you know, perhaps the first one to get to market. Do you also see an area, just from a government perspective, where you can still kind of bring in the new technology that may not have the mass distribution that big pharma has, but also provide that innovation that is needed?
Yes, absolutely, and I think BioNTech, but there are dozens of examples within the rare disease space, within other innovative disease spaces, where smaller biotech companies, often spin-offs from universities, are absorbed almost by big pharma, which is a good thing, because what we want is to get the drugs from the shelf, or at least from the laboratory to the shelf to the patient, right? And oftentimes it's the last step the first step from the lab to the shelf is often not possible without big pharma's resources and their ability to run clinical trials, their ability to scale up things, and especially for BioNTech, they had the technology, or for example for BioNTech, they had the technology, but they didn't have the resources to put it to scale and at least not to move that quickly, like in less than a year. So obviously, like I see there's great collaboration and they almost need each other. But then again, and touching upon my first point, I think we have to be very mindful of the fact that, and especially in Europe, like those spin-offs, or those university BioNTech spin-offs are funded by governments, and then big pharma comes in. So I think we need to work together, but we have to respect each other's IP and the fact that as a government, we aim to pay a fair price, but we don't want to pay twice, as I may put it.
And Reda, do you want to follow up on that? Just because,
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Definitely. So I think Sam brought up a very important point. And I'd like to clarify on how, the model that research-based companies, pharmaceutical companies, abide by. So I'll just give you an example of Pfizer and rare disease. We work based on three things. The first one is building. So we build, we call it building, which is developing a molecule from end to end, going from the laboratory to clinical development to regulatory to the patients, etc. And the majority of molecules that you see today in patient hands are usually through this build approach. The second approach is basically to collaborate with institutions, academic institutions, biotechnology companies, etc. And this is the model that Pfizer has followed with BioNTech. And we have many other models like this in rare disease. We just signed last year an agreement also, a co-development agreement with Vivet, which is a French company. There's also the buying a technology. So we have to go and look for technologies out there and the best science that is within our walls or outside our walls. Now, I want to highlight one thing. Once we collaborate, if we don't do it, who else will do it? The reason I'm saying this is very simply because for every collaboration that works, you have at least 10 other collaborations that do not work. You see, you don't know when you start collaborating with a company, you never know what it will deliver 10 years down the road. So the risk is extremely high. And today, pharma, because we believe in science, and our purpose is really to bring innovation to patients, we invest and take huge risks, incredible risks. I don't think there is another sector that will invest in something that is has 90% probability of failure or 10% probability of winning. So this is a very important point. And also to Sam's point, you get fantastic scientists out there with molecules, and then bringing them throughout the full clinical development that might take years with different phases, and then regulatory, and then manufacturing, which is very, very complex manufacturing, especially for innovative medicines, biological agents, vaccines, etc. Is very complex, and you need to make sure that all the batches that are out there look like each other, etc. And then there's distribution, and once it reaches the patients, real-world evidence. So the investment continues for years, and it's a very, very long process, and you need experience, you need credibility in order to do that.
Right. So I guess you're bringing up 2 points. First of all, that the startups would need the distribution and the scale up that big pharma brings in, but also it's that risk that you take on the clinical and the trial stage where it can flop or actually work, where that pressure is big on big pharma, I understand. But I also wonder, Julia, if you could just follow up on that, because he's bringing up 2 points, which again go back to the idea of collaboration, and again goes back to the idea of leveraging the scale and the numbers. Where do you see the European Union playing into these, in particular in areas like rare diseases? This is something where the treatment is not mainstream, it's perhaps niche, but it's also needed for citizens, and they actively would require that treatment. So is there any way or any areas in which you say we could leverage, perhaps by pooling resources, by bringing together some of the data that goes into clinical trials? Where do you see the European Union feeding into that?
So thank you very much for your question, but also thank you to Reda to bring all these points up, because the healthcare sector, and now let's stick to the pharma sector, but it can be extended to other sectors, diagnostics, etc., is a very important industry in Europe. It's an industry that deals with key enabling technologies and very high added value. And it is a normal industrial sector in this, in this pool of key enabling technology sectors. It needs very skilled labor force. It needs a stable political environment. It needs rule of law. it needs strong local collaboration with universities, etc. And that's not particular to the pharma sector. Let's say there are a number of sectors like that, and Europe is doing better and better a lot of work on that in fostering this kind of ecosystems, because we have 27 member states, but more and more we have common rules, more and more we have a very big research framework program. We have the EIB more and more investing in these technologies. What makes this sector particular is that the main client, but let's say the main payer, is the state, and it's the national state. So you and me, we go to the doctor and buy a drug, but we get, in one way or another, in all 27 member states, reimbursement. And when I say 27, it's 27 types of reimbursement. Can even be more if you had in some member states the regional levels. So in a way, and that has been said already, we finance the research, we or the member states finance the startups, we finance the education system, we finance, when I say we, is national or regional authorities and European authorities, and eventually we pay for the product. And that makes this sector particular, and that makes collaboration so important. This sector is very regulated because it is, drugs interact with our body, but chemicals as well. So chemicals are regulated, drugs are often chemicals, but also it is very regulated because the payer is the authority. And that's why investing in the whole value chain is particularly important, because employment, because risks, because incredible benefits for the economy and for the citizen. But this investment is to be taken up and decided very carefully. What we've been doing for years and what the crisis has shown is collaboration is key at European, national, and local level. Collaboration is key in a university cluster as well, inside, let's say, an industrial region. And it has shown that transparency, and transparency is tricky, and I would like to hear what the other panelists say about it. Transparency is key.
Right.
But you have industrial data, but you have health data, but you have data privacy, you have a lot of things. We must be able to talk in a way that respects all these rules and that respects the financial interest. Thank you.
Right, and Julia, I guess what you're saying is that perhaps to some extent the best way to protect taxpayer also money investment, as you point out, in many European countries, the state does pay a lot of money for all of those medical treatments, is actually perhaps to think bigger, to go beyond the sovereignty limits of your country perhaps, and going broader on the European angle could ultimately end up being the more efficient way for a patient to get a treatment, essentially. That's what you're saying, scale up on a European level.
Again, it depends. As I said, this is a sector that is incredibly local and incredibly global. And some touched on the example of the orphan medicines, which is a very good example where he said we don't have enough patients even in Germany. So you need collaboration, and a lot has been done with European reference networks and pooling data, and association of patients have done a lot on that. In the case of vaccines, in a way, it's the same, and it's very different because we need to vaccinate everybody, and that's why size mattered. And I think for us, it was very important to negotiate at European level, and the member states did not hesitate much or at all. And I would imagine that it was very important for the companies as well. Size matters, but local matters as well. And the case by case, these things have to be decided. Never forget that pricing and reimbursement is responsibility of the member states, and rightly so, because the situation is not the same in a region of the south of Italy and in Länder in Germany, and is not the same in Denmark and in Malta. But we need, it's a complex matrix, and we need to get there, and collaboration is the word.
Right.
The word, sorry.
And you mentioned data, and Jean-Michel, I have a very simple question for you. How important is data for the insurer of the 21st century?
Data is really important and really a key to differentiation, but you have to use it in the good way and to build trust. And it comes back to what Julia shared. It's about transparency, explicit consent before you use the data, and then you can use the data. And for us, we see the importance of data not only for insurance, which of course data can help you better price, better see your risk, and really help have people the best product for them. But it's also using data to help them navigate the healthcare system. And going back to what I shared at the beginning, we use more data for proactive care notification. For example, telling you when to do a checkup at the dentist, when to do a checkup at the dermatologist, and that you are going to be fully covered as a key differentiator. And for us is how we use that data and we do that trust agreement, trust contract with our members to use it to display them personalized information. So what's the information I need to read at the right time, personalized prevention and proactive care, and personalized access to care, depending on what I do. And so I think data is going to be really important, and it comes back to how do we collaborate with the state, with other providers to have a unified pool of data so we can improve outcomes over time, how we are very transparent on how you use data. And I'll just go back to what Julia said. It's, Alan, we operate as a health insurance company in France, Spain, and Belgium. So we see very different systems, very different payer model, very different network model. And at the end of the day, the jobs to be done, what people want is the same. So I think the job of data and of automation and of machine learning is trying to match very complex system with the same needs and to simplify that. And it's a very big challenge to do that at the European level. But I think that is going to make the difference in the next 5 to 10 years.
Right, and you touched on a good point, which is the data, the transparency, and just trust overall when it comes to those three areas. But I would want to do a follow-up on that point that you mentioned, because we have seen during this pandemic that people were told, something very simple, just download an app and then you're going to be tracked and it's going to help prevent the spread of the virus. But in many countries, it didn't work. And one of the reasons why it didn't work is because people simply did not trust the app. They didn't want to put forward that data, and they were unsure over what could be done with that data. So Jean-Charles, how do we fix this? How do we go about it? Because I guess just the app is something that I personally found very striking, that people just did not trust the system.
Yeah, we saw that in France, where we had two phases. Like, we had an app named Stop COVID, and honestly, it was a flop. It didn't work. Like, it was a few 100,000 downloads. Mm-hmm. And now they have just launched again the app, and we are close to the 15 million downloads. And so there has been a dramatic change in the way approach that. And I think it's a matter of explanation and transparency, and it takes time. It takes a lot of time to explain trade-off. It takes a lot of time to explain why we do things, to explain the hard decisions, and for people to comprehend them. So I think, and it's normal in a time of crisis, that people rushed into trying to have people download the app, because for them it was so obvious that it was the right thing to do, and they did not spend the time, and it should have been weeks and weeks, to explain why it makes sense, why people are protected, and what are the outcomes, and that it can fail as well. And I think one of the risks for governments, and it's very tough, and we see that as a company, is to try to show that you are in control of everything, and everything is going to be perfect. And when you do that, you are challenged a lot. When you say, we don't have the perfect solution, but we need to try things as a group to try to find a solution, then people are a lot more willing to test, to try, and to trust. And I think it was a change of tone and the change of explanation that really helped in that case in France.
Right, and I guess, you know, you make a good point here too, because we're seeing a case in which the technology actually worked, the technology was ready, but it was almost a human touch that was missing. It was the explaining, the learning, winning that trust. And it's a good point to be made because it's also now going into the vaccine that could potentially be rolled out, where there's this almost gap between the technology available and that public trust going into it. And Sam, I know that you want to do a follow-up, so go ahead.
No, very briefly, I think it may come down to the fact like people don't really see what's in for them in terms of data, right? So they see the app, they see a lot of data gathering, and then they have their mistrust or their concerns of whatever. But if you communicate clearly, like what's in for me, like your risk of becoming infected if you use the app accordingly or properly is going to decrease. The same with all the data in terms of prevention. I think it was touched upon by Jean-Charles as well. If we can people make understand that by collection of data we can improve prevention and we can ultimately prevent them from getting a disease. So really state clearly, like the what's in for you in this is that you're not becoming ill. I think that's paramount importance, and I think that would be the one prime convincing factor for people to use technology and to share their data.
And Julia, do you want to follow up on that, just from the perspective of the institutions, especially now that there's a big major vaccine rollout that will not be mandatory, will depend on whether or not people want to get this vaccine?
So first of all, on the app, you know, the first thing I do in the morning is look at the data on Corona Alert and the Belgian app. And I totally agree with Sam. People have to see what's in for them. In my case, what I love is I get the data. Every morning, I see if we are flattening the curve. Obviously, I'm not let's say the average customer because that interests me. But honestly, I think anybody very easily can feel how the crisis is going. I don't have any contacts. I arrived, my maximum was 4 low-risk contacts, and I can see that, and I can also see that it's totally anonymous, because I know I met some people that were sick, but I don't know when or what. So I think the experience, again, to go back to what Jean-Charles said, the experience with the apps is the same thing as the experience with the patient. We are on data. Data is very important. We are working on this European health data to ensure the privacy, to ensure accessibility to the actors that need the data. And for the vaccine campaign, the data, as for all vaccination campaigns, is very important. I mentioned it before. You need to be able to avoid fraud very easily, to be able to track adverse effects. You need to be able to track second doses when it's necessary. In this particular case, for those who will be part of the phase 3 trial, companies will need to know if immunity lasts or not, so it's particularly important. Vaccination campaigns in Europe are a long tradition, but systems are different. You need basically 2 sets of data. The person, one single identification for every single person, and the little number of the vials. So it's not particularly difficult conceptually, but there are 27 or more when you have region systems. Not all systems are digitalized. And we will need to figure a way to make systems compatible, and also, everybody read it in the press, to have secondary use of the data. Secondary use is a tricky thing because of data privacy, but one could imagine that vaccination is not compulsory, but is compulsory for certain activities. I don't know, working in a meat packing plant, traveling, going to school, going to, I don't know, summer camp. So if you have to give the proof, that will need to be, because we are talking about nearly 500 million people, because also you have to count people coming into Europe, you will need to do it in a way that is recognized, that is trusted by the operators, and where, again, people don't think that their privacy is impinged. One example that I give often is that you are planning to go on a safari in India, or in Africa or whatever. Most probably you will be asked to have your little yellow passport with your yellow fever. Yellow fever identifies you together with your passport, so one set of data, and two, it gets the date and the little number of the vial you had your vaccination from. This document is accepted in all passports, and I have no problem, because I'm going for my holiday, to show my little yellow passport.
Right.
Obviously, we are not talking about a limited number of persons. We are talking about billions of persons that potentially for their activities will need to show this yellow slip of paper. By the way, just to talk about trust, to get this, for those of you who did the yellow fever thing, you have to go to a specialized center, because you have only a few centers in Brussels that are allowed to do that. The doctor tells you awful stories about the adverse effects you could have, and still we all do it.
Right.
Because we see what's in it for us. I have a business trip. I'm going to see my grandmother. I am going to go on a fabulous trip. What's in it for me? How my data is processed. And this can be done. It can be done for yellow fever, and it's not an elite thing about going to a safari. A lot of people need to go and see their family. It can be done for vaccination campaigns, and it has to be done very much carefully. Thank you.
Right, and Rada, I was wondering if you could touch on the data, because I guess from your perspective, data is also about research. It's also the difference between a treatment that may work, one that may not work, and I know that there's a very active debate too in the pharma community about the primary and secondary data, and how having access to the secondary data may actually help the research that gets done in that whole value chain that is very sophisticated in terms of the sample and the information that you need. So how do you look at data? How do you approach it? And what is the key aspect for a pharma company when it comes to accessing the data that will actually make that difference?
Sure, and this is a very important point. When you talk about data starts very early on in development. So, data in humans, once you translate, a product from the laboratory to patients in phase 1, this is where data starts. And you start with a small number of patients, and then, you look at safety, and then later on phase 2 efficacy, and then you go to a larger trial, which is the randomized clinical trial. To Sam's point, this is data. You have usually, like what happened in vaccines, independent data monitoring committee that looks at the data, that decides if the trial should continue or not, analyzing the data, and then it sends it to the company. Now, the company uses it. This is the same process that happens across all therapeutic areas. Take oncology, take depression, same thing with rare diseases, okay? And based on this data, it's then presented to the regulatory authorities, and this is, the process, how it works. Now, the interesting thing is that today we're looking at real-world evidence. This means that once the product reaches, to Maria's point, when she's talking about billions in the case of vaccines, and, tens of millions in the case of rare disease, there are systems that are put in place to follow the patients, and this is where you get real-world evidence that, by the way, will be shared with the regulatory authorities, because regulatory authorities, every number of months, they would come back, and we as part of the rules have to present the safety, especially the safety update reports. That's one important thing. We also, collect this data and share it with payers. It's extremely important because they want to know it worked in the phase 3 trials, the product worked, but however, now we're looking at new payment models that look at pay for performance. So payers need to understand if the product long-term, if it still delivers what it has promised. And also scientifically, the larger the population, the more we learn, the more it's used across different segments of the populations, different ages, for example, or patients with different risk groups. And it's all this data that is always monitored and shared with the regulatory authorities, or in some cases, of course, with payers. So
right.
This is how data in general is being managed.
Right, and the regulation is key. And that takes me to a question for you, Jean-Charles. I think that we all can agree that when you look at innovation, you need to have the technology, the regulation, and also the distribution align and come together, be at the same speed. Would you say that right now in Europe, especially as we head into this potential new health union coming out of the EU and potential more regulation, are we up to speed and are we aligned enough so that a company like you can benefit from that innovation?
That's a very tough question to answer, but a very important one. Indeed, us as a new insurance company, so we were the only new independent insurance company in France since 1986, we had to put together regulation, product, innovation, distribution, and it's very hard to pull that together. And what you want is have a stable view on regulation in order to be able to improve that. I feel that the current crisis has more created an opportunity to have collaborative discussions on what we should improve as a system. My bet and my hope is that we need to keep that trend in the next years and not just go back to the past. But if we manage to do that and to have more discussion between public and private, in France or in Belgium, we are complementary to the state system. You have mutualité and you have private health insurance, or you have sécurité sociale and private health insurance. And I think there has been some kind of opposition in the past of private or public should win, we should own that and that. And I think the objective and what we should aim to do, every kind of company, is how we can build things together that improve the outcome, the quality of the experience for the patient, for the user. And that is going to be really tough because, like, who you talk to, you have many stakeholders, you need to assemble that. Who represents well an industry? We see in France, for example, that we have very different point of views from classic insurance companies. So should the state talk to us? Should they talk to all the other players? But here is the opportunity. We had more adoption on telemedicine in the last year than in the past 5 years combined. So how we keep that acceleration of digitalization of healthcare, of making healthcare more affordable, making the experience of healthcare better, and this only come if public and private works together.
Right.
So I don't have like a perfect answer, but we need to do it together.
Right, and you also bring up a point that is, I would say, very real, and it's a real debate. And Sam, I wonder if you could weigh in on this. You know, there has been for a few years now this idea that too much is being stripped away from public health, that there's too much being put in private hands. Now we've seen that with coronavirus, you could not do this independently. The only way this worked is because the two actually had to come together and pull in those resources. So I wonder if this pandemic is going to change the view of that almost dilemma versus private versus the public one, too much being taken from one, too much given to another one. Are you headed into a new type of collaboration after this, or are we potentially back to just the old dilemma, which one do you go for?
Okay, yeah, not an easy question. I think you're right. I think another lesson learned, and it's very close to what you just mentioned, is the fact that we largely underfunded prevention in the past decades, not only in terms of pandemic preparedness, but also and COVID-19 has been an emblematic example. We have failed in terms of preventing NCDs, the non-communicable diseases, right? The burden in hospitals the world over is largely determined by people with comorbidities such as hypertension, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, etc. So I think that's one. I think as a government, we have to reconcile, we have to contemplate at least very, how would I say, very deeply on the fact that we failed to prevent diseases, and that's how the pandemic got out of hand, and we're in so much trouble at this point. Secondly, I think the conversation is much more friendly, by lack of another word, in Europe versus the US. As Jean-Charles said, their insurance or their service is complementary to the government, right? Whereas in the US, the private insurers basically take up the role of the government, or they pay up to 100% of the cost. Whereas in the out-of-pocket payment in Europe is fairly limited. For example, in Belgium, it's 20%. So Jean-Charles comes in and they pay the 20%, and the 80% is paid by government. So I think it's a good balance, and collaboration between the private and the public has to intensify. But I think the odds and how would I say, the contradiction or the rivalry almost between insurers and public institutions, such as at times in the US, is just not here in Europe, and we have to. I think the system such as it exists now works, and I think the private sector can stimulate or motivate people to spend more on prevention, for example, and really go the extra mile where the government just lacks the resources to spend an extra effort on preventing especially non-communicable diseases. Yeah, I don't know if that's an answer to your question. It was a complicated one, but I hope I made the point.
Yeah, and look, that takes me to another question to you, Reda, because ultimately this is also about the patient experience and the patient being able to get the treatment that he needs or she needs. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a point into any of this. So I do wonder, now that we've had the experience from the pandemic in which you have a major treatment being developed very quickly, being put to the market very quickly, going through all of the clinical trials, getting the access on the data and the samples of patients that are needed, would you draw any lessons? Are there any lessons to be drawn that could be applied to something like rare diseases? And I know that this is an area where you focus and you concentrate. And the reason why I want to mention rare diseases is because, again, we're looking at a product that does require a lot of investment, that does require a lot of testing, clinical trials that could work, may not work, but ultimately it's not a major mainstream drug. It still remains a niche treatment.
Yes, the answer is there are parallels, I think, not just in rare diseases, but in many other therapeutic areas. You can add there, for example, oncology, for example, as another example. And we can accelerate the development of products like what we've seen with vaccines. Just to talk about rare diseases, you pointed out to a very important point, which is the number of patients. Yeah. A rare disease in Europe, the definition is less than one case out of 2,000 inhabitants, okay? So it's more or less, it's 10,000, less than 10,000 in 100,000, I think, whatever it is, but it's less than one in 2,000 inhabitants. And the number of cases overall in Europe are around 30 million cases. However, the 30 million, when we speak about rare diseases, they are segmented across 7,000 diseases. So you have 7,000 diseases, and today we have treatment just for 5%. 5% is disease, which means that there are 28.5 million patients still waiting for a treatment. And this is why we need to find ways to accelerate the treatment. And, if we want to accelerate it, it's what I mentioned before. We need to accelerate to find the incentives for clinical trials. That's extremely important. Regulatory-wise, I heard Julia, I agree with you, Julia, safety is important, efficacy is important, but still, are there ways we can a little bit more, make it easier, oil a little bit more the machine, whatever it takes to ensure that these products make it. And the last point I wanted to say there is, in 2000 in Europe, there was the orphan medicinal product regulation that was put in place. And thanks to this regulation, we moved somewhere from 8 products, if I recall, up to 164 products that made it until today. Now, half of these products in patient hands wouldn't have made it if it weren't for they wouldn't have been, I would say, economically viable if it weren't for this regulation. We're looking now at this regulation, which is currently being reviewed. I hope the incentives will stay there, especially when it comes to, incentives for IP, intellectual property, incentives when it comes to the number of years that the product is protected, which is currently 10 years. So all this is being reviewed. So you need, I would say, an environment or an ecosystem that allows for specific diseases with very limited number of patients, incentives to invest there and to accelerate the development.
Right. And Julie, I want to put a final question to you since we're running out of time. But, during the session, we've talked about a number of issues, the private, the public, the access to the information, the trials, and we've talked about the role that insurers may play into this and also trust. But the one issue we haven't talked about, and it's really key, is political will. In the European Union, as it stands right now, is really very much about the member states. It's really about the control that they have over what has been until now seen as a national issue. It's not for the EU to decide, it's for each member state. But to go bigger, to go give it that scale that we've talked about, and to really pull all the resources together, you need that political will to come together. Do you think we have it now after the pandemic?
Definitely. I think what the pandemic showed, and it's not new, it's something that was already there. And by the way, we can see it in all the orphan diseases management, is that health and welfare are so important in the identity of Europe. And when this regulation was put through, it was put through because we really believe in Europe that we have to invest a lot for the health of very few, for the potential health of very few, which is personally, I think, a beautiful thing. And it's beautiful to do it in law without anticipating the costs, and then you see the costs and people get worried, and then we will have to review. But the philosophy is there, and it's there to stay. And we saw it in the crisis. It's not about rare diseases, but it's about a disease that affects more certain categories of the population, which are the elderly, the people with comorbidity, mainly. Then it can happen to me, or it can happen to my son. But let's say that statistically it affects a part of the population, and we are ready, and it's beautiful, to lock down a complete continent. And we are ready to foot the bill. But there are risks, economics risks, mental health risks, risk for the education of my children, of our children. And that's where size and political will is so important. If we want to get out well from this crisis, we have to do things at the right level. And it's the old thing about subsidiarity, but subsidiarity is not a fact. Every single moment you have to decide what is the right level in the companies, what is the right level of research, at the patients, what is the right level of intervention, and politically, where do you have to work together? When the President von der Leyen talked about creating a health union, she's not saying about taking out pricing competencies from member states. She's saying we have common values. We've seen in very difficult times that we have common values, that health is key for what we are and for what we want from society. And then we have to work together at European level when it's needed, but to have really a European steer and to work together with all stakeholders that a number are represented here, We just miss the patients, and I think we can say a lot about it. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Appreciate it. I want to thank our 4 panelists for joining us. We have reached the end of this session, but the European Health Summit continues right after a short break. Stay with us. Well, welcome back to the European Health Summit. And now I am very pleased to say we are joined by Jens Spahn, who is chairman at CureVac. And thank you so much, first of all, for joining us, because I know you are very busy with the vaccine. This is something that you're actively working on. And, you know, that was my first question. I know you are working on getting your own treatment. Where is the CureVac vaccine standing at this point?
But the CureVac vaccine is the third mRNA vaccine, and we are just 3 to 4 months behind Moderna and Pfizer. But our technology is similar.